It started with a light fixture and a receipt that said 1 cent. Acura, Amanda, and Palm Beach Free Press were doing what millions of Americans do on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. They were shopping at Home Depot, picking up things for the house, moving through the aisles, checking prices, grabbing what they needed. They were also First Amendment auditors, a real-life couple who document their interactions with law enforcement and post them online. But on this particular afternoon in West Palm Beach, Florida, they weren't auditing anything. They were just shopping. They found a pendant light. They liked it. They took it to the self-checkout, scanned it, and the register displayed a price of 1 cent. They paid it. They got a receipt. They started walking toward the door. And that's when a Home Depot employee stopped them. The employee told them the item had not scanned correctly. The price was wrong. They needed to come back, correct the charge, and pay the actual retail price before they could leave. Amanda and her partner disagreed. They had a receipt. They had paid. The transaction was complete. They wanted to leave. The employee called the police. Officer Anthony Gawando of the West Palm Beach Police Department responded to the call. And what followed over the next several minutes was a collision between retail policy, Florida theft law, contract law, constitutional rights, and the fundamental question of whether paying a penny for something that costs significantly more is a mistake, a windfall, or a crime. When Officer Gawando arrived, the situation had already reached a standoff. The Home Depot employee explained her side. The customers had used the self-checkout. The pendant light had scanned for 1 cent. She had told them the price was wrong and needed to be corrected. They had refused and tried to walk out. She had called for assistance. Amanda and her partner explained their side. They had not altered any price tag. They had not switched any labels. They had not done anything to manipulate the system. They had scanned the item, paid what the register asked them to pay, received a receipt, and considered the transaction complete. If the store's pricing system was broken, that was the store's problem, not theirs. Gawando listened to both sides. He was calm. He was measured. He didn't jump to conclusions. He said, essentially, that there seemed to be an innocent explanation here, and that he just needed a few minutes to sort it out. Then Amanda asked the question that changed the nature of the encounter. Are we being detained right now? Gawando paused. He acknowledged that yes, technically they were being detained while he investigated the allegation. Amanda's follow-up was immediate. Why are we being detained? We didn't steal anything. And Gawando explained that a theft allegation had been made, and he needed to investigate it before they could leave. That was the moment this stopped being a retail dispute and became a legal question with real constitutional stakes. Let's start with the most basic question. Was what happened at that self-checkout register a crime? Under Section 812.014 of the Florida statutes, a person commits theft if they knowingly obtain or use the property of another with the intent to temporarily or permanently deprive that person of the right to the property or a benefit from it. The key word in that definition is knowingly. Criminal intent is not optional in a theft charge. It is the foundation of the offense. Florida's retail theft statute, Section 812.015, goes further. It specifically defines retail theft as taking possession of merchandise, altering or removing a price tag, transferring merchandise from one container to another, or removing a shopping cart with the intent to deprive the merchant of possession, use, benefit, or full retail value. The statute is clearly designed to capture the kinds of deliberate manipulations that shoplifters use, switching price tags, repackaging items, concealing merchandise, schemes with a purpose behind them. Amanda and her partner had not done any of those things. They had used the self-checkout. The register produced a price. They paid that price. If anyone made a mistake in that transaction, it was the store's pricing system, not the customer standing at the terminal. Florida law requires specific criminal intent to establish theft. A genuine mistake at checkout, without any evidence that the customer intended to underpay, does not typically rise to the level of a crime. Receiving a benefit from the store's own error is not by itself theft. The intent has to be there, and there was no evidence of intent. Based on the facts as they appeared at the moment of purchase, this looked like a civil matter, not a criminal one. But then the situation evolved, and the law evolved with it. Once the Home Depot employee discovered the undercharge and demanded either additional payment or the return of the item, the legal landscape shifted. Florida contract law allows for a concept called rescission. Under certain circumstances, a contract that has already been formed can be canceled if one party made a significant mistake in establishing the terms. The 3rd District Court of Appeal of Florida addressed exactly this kind of situation in a 2018 case involving a diamond sold for a fraction of its actual value due to a pricing error. The court found that the contract could be rescinded for unilateral mistake even without any misrepresentation or deliberate action by the buyer. Apply that principle here. Home Depot could potentially argue that the 1 cent price was a unilateral mistake of material fact and that the contract of sale could therefore be rescinded. If a court agreed with that argument, then Home Depot would have had the legal right to demand the return of the item or the payment of the correct price. And here is where it gets complicated. If Amanda and her partner knew they had been dramatically undercharged, and the store had told them directly that the transaction needed to be corrected, and they refused to correct it and attempted to leave with the item, a prosecutor could theoretically argue that at that point they were intentionally depriving the store of the full retail value of the merchandise. That the moment of informed refusal was the moment criminal intent attached. It is a stretch. It is far more likely that a court would treat this entire situation as a civil dispute about contract rescission rather than a criminal theft case. Amanda and her partner had lawfully purchased the item and held legal title to it. The criminal intent threshold for theft is high, and the circumstances here do not clearly meet it. But the argument is not frivolous. It exists, and that is precisely why the legal situation was genuinely murky rather than straightforwardly clear in either direction. Back outside the store, Officer Goandu was trying to navigate all of this in real time without a law degree and without the luxury of sitting down to read appellate decisions. Amanda pressed him on the shopkeeper's privilege. Florida Shopkeeper Statute, Section 812.015, gives merchants and law enforcement officers the right to detain a person they have probable cause to believe has committed retail theft for the purpose of attempting to recover the property or for prosecution. The detention has to be reasonable in manner and reasonable in duration. But Goandu wasn't limited only to the shopkeeper statute. As a law enforcement officer, he also had the authority to conduct what's known as a Terry stop based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The Supreme Court established this framework in the landmark case of Terry v. Ohio, and Florida codified it in Section 901.151 of the Florida statutes, known as the Florida Stop and Frisk Law. Under that standard, whenever an officer encounters a person under circumstances that reasonably indicate they have committed, are committing, or are about to commit a crime, the officer may temporarily detain them to investigate. The Supreme Court reinforced the breadth of this authority in Illinois v. Wardlow in 2000, holding that an investigative stop can be constitutional even when the individual's behavior has an innocent explanation, because officers are permitted to detain people to resolve ambiguities. And in District of Columbia v. Wesby in 2018, the court made clear that officers are not required to simply accept a suspect's innocent explanation at face value. Applied here, even with Amanda's explanation that they had simply paid what the register charged them, a court could find that Goandu had reasonable suspicion to briefly detain them. They were in possession of merchandise. The store claimed it had not been properly paid for. The statutory framework around retail theft contemplates intentional exploitation of pricing errors as a potential offense. The situation was ambiguous. The law permits brief detention to resolve ambiguity. Goandu's decision to detain was within his authority. While Goandu made calls and waited for a supervisor, Amanda made an argument that is worth addressing directly because it reflects a widely held but legally inaccurate belief about police detentions. She said that courts had established that citizens cannot be constitutionally detained for longer than 45 minutes during a Terry stop. It is understandable why this idea circulates. It sounds like a clear rule. It gives people something concrete to point to. But it is not the law. The Supreme Court has repeatedly and explicitly declined to impose a fixed time limit on investigative detentions. In United States v. Place in 1983, the court found that a 90-minute detention was too long under the specific facts of that case. But in the same opinion, the court was explicit that it was not adopting any outside time limitation for Terry stops. 2 years later, in United States v. Sharp, the court reiterated that there is no rigid time limitation on Terry stops, and that the appropriate question is whether the officers diligently pursued the means of investigation likely to confirm or dispel their suspicion quickly. The court also acknowledged the flexibility of this standard in United States v. Montoya de Hernandez, where it upheld a detention that lasted more than 12 hours under exceptional circumstances involving a drug trafficking suspect. That case was extreme and the circumstances were extraordinary. But it illustrates that no fixed ceiling exists. The legal standard for Terry stops is not a clock. It is a question of whether the detention was temporary, whether it lasted no longer than necessary to accomplish its purpose, and whether the officers pursued the investigation diligently. Those are fact-specific determinations. They vary from case to case. Amanda's broader concern that an overly long detention in a case this flimsy was constitutionally problematic was legitimate. The specific legal claim about 45 minutes was not. As the minutes passed, something notable happened, or rather, something notable did not happen. Home Depot's management did not come outside. Goandu was trying to sort out a situation that the store had created by calling the police in the first place. He had detained 2 people, he had called for a supervisor, he was waiting for someone from the store to come out and provide documentation, clarification, anything that would move the investigation forward. Nobody came. Amanda observed this with increasing frustration. She had a dishwasher at home that she needed to install. She had a cart full of items she had paid for sitting outside a Home Depot. She was being detained over a penny, and the store that had called the police couldn't be bothered to send anyone out to follow through on the complaint they had initiated. She raised this point directly with Goandu. The store isn't even out here. This is their complaint. Where are they? Goandu didn't have a good answer for that, because there wasn't one. If a business calls law enforcement to report a theft, the minimum expectation is that the business will cooperate with the resulting investigation. Home Depot had not done that. Goandu looked at the receipt. He examined the item. He confirmed that the SKU on the receipt matched the item in the cart. He could see that Amanda and her partner had paid for everything in their cart. He could see that the transaction had generated a receipt. And he could see that the store, having initiated this entire situation, was nowhere to be found. He made a decision. You guys are good to go. He apologized. He acknowledged that they had been cooperative. He let them leave. That decision is worth examining carefully because it reveals something important about how discretion functions in law enforcement. Goandu had the legal authority to continue the detention. He had arguably the legal authority to make an arrest if he concluded that the threshold for probable cause had been met. The fact that this was a borderline case, that the criminal intent argument was thin, that a court might well have dismissed any charges as a civil matter, none of that stripped him of his authority to pursue it if he believed the situation warranted it. He chose not to. He looked at the totality of what he had in front of him. Two people with a receipt, a store that had made a pricing error and then couldn't be bothered to come outside and support the complaint it had filed. An allegation of theft built on circumstances that looked far more like a retail dispute than a criminal act. And two individuals who had been calm, cooperative, and consistent throughout the entire encounter. He weighed all of that and he let them go. That is discretion working the way it is supposed to work. Not reflexively escalating because an allegation has been made. Not mechanically pursuing a legal theory because it technically fits, but evaluating the actual situation in front of you and making a judgment call about what the circumstances genuinely warrant. Goandu got that right. After both parties posted their footage online, the legal community and the First Amendment auditing community spent considerable time debating who was right and who was wrong in this encounter. The answer, honestly, is that almost everyone involved was operating in a gray zone. Home Depot had a legitimate interest in correcting a pricing error. The mechanism for doing that after a transaction has been completed is civil rescission, not criminal charges. Calling the police on customers who paid what the register charged them was an overreaction that shifted a civil dispute into a criminal context it probably didn't belong in. The store employee was likely trying to do her job. She saw a transaction that looked wrong and she escalated it the way her training probably told her to. But calling law enforcement to resolve what was fundamentally a pricing system failure was the wrong tool for the problem. Goandu was presented with an allegation that had some legal basis, even if thin. He had the authority to detain. He used that authority proportionately. He didn't threaten, didn't coerce, didn't manufacture urgency. And when the store failed to support its own complaint, he made the right call. Amanda and her partner understood the situation better than most people in their position would have. They knew their rights, they asked the right questions, they documented everything. They remained composed when being accused of theft for paying what a store's own register charged them. That composure mattered. Where they were slightly off was in the claim about a 45-minute limit. It's a common belief. It sounds like established law. It isn't. And the difference between a legal argument that is accurate and one that merely sounds accurate matters, especially when you're asserting your rights in the middle of a police encounter. There is a larger story here that the penny and the pendant light are almost too small to contain. Every day across the country, police officers are called to resolve situations that are not criminal matters, disputes between neighbors, arguments between customers and businesses, misunderstandings at registers and parking lots and front doors. Officers are summoned not because a crime has occurred, but because someone with access to a phone decided that their frustration warranted a police response. When that happens, the officer who shows up inherits a situation they didn't create with incomplete information, under pressure to act decisively while also acting correctly. They have to assess in real time whether what they are looking at is actually a crime, whether they have the legal authority to act, and what the right proportional response looks like. Goandu did all of that well. He acknowledged the allegation, he investigated it appropriately, he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't apply pressure he wasn't authorized to apply. He waited for the store to follow through on its own complaint. When it didn't, he released the people who had been detained as a result of that complaint. That is not a dramatic story. There was no arrest, no confrontation, no viral moment of outrage, just a professional working through a genuinely ambiguous situation with competence and restraint and making the right call at the end. Those encounters don't get as much attention as the ones that go wrong, but they are worth recognizing. The receipt said 1 cent. The register accepted 1 cent. Two people paid 1 cent, took their item, and walked toward the exit. Everything that followed, the employee, the police, the detention, the legal questions about contract rescission and criminal intent, and the duration of Terry's stops, all of it traced back to a pricing system that produced a number nobody expected and a store that didn't know how to handle the aftermath. The item was paid for, the receipt was real. The people holding it had done nothing that a reasonable person, looking at the full picture, could call a crime. Officer Goandu saw that clearly. Eventually, And sometimes in these encounters, eventually is enough.